The Horn of Africa is endowed with so many natural resources. Above all, the Horn of Africa is strategically the most important region in the world. However, countries of the Horn of Africa are in ardent poverty and recurring crises. So the question is, how can the Horn of African countries can leverage the importance, the significance of the region for better growth and stability? Hello and welcome, viewers. You are watching our weekly edition, Messenger. My guest for today is Professor Macharia Munen. Professor Macharia Munen is Professor of History and International Relations at the United States International University. Professor Macharia Munen is also Associate Fellow at Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. So we are reaching Professor Macharia Munen via Skype. He is in Nairobi, Kenya today. Hello, Professor Macharia. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. I can hear you very well and glad to be with you.
Perfect. It's great to have you in my show, Professor Macharia. But first, can you paint the picture of the Horn of Africa for us, like where the Horn of Africa is situated, located, and which countries it comprises of? Tell us the geography, history, the culture, and other stuffs.
Well, the Horn of Africa has about 7-8 countries, linkage with the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Peninsula in the north across the Red Sea. And then the countries themselves, you have Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and Somalia. So about those number of countries that are together geographically, an area that is strategic in terms of the rest of the world because it is the communication route going to Europe and going to Asia from the Europeans and from the Asians. So it is important to those people. That's why it is strategic to their interest. Then you have the common problem of instability, induced instability. Some of that is domestic. Others are propelled from outside the continent. So the interest of the outside forces or powers in the Horn of Africa.
Professor, sorry for interruption. I will come to that problem, the challenge of the Horn of Africa in terms of the outside force later in my show. But briefly tell us the history of the Horn of Africa and the diverse nature of the Horn of Africa. Like the Horn of Africa is a mix of Africa, Arab, and other indigenous identity. So tell us a little bit about the population, the language, the identity, and so forth.
Well, we have kind of a mixture of many peoples. We have some people who trace their lineage to the Arabs. We have others who are of Indian background. And we have some Europeans, the colonizers, as they were. And then we have other people from different intermingling of peoples. The Nile Valley, the Great Lakes, and the Swahili coast in the Eastern. But the countries as they exist today are really a creation of European imperialism, all of them, including Ethiopia, in the sense that when the Europeans were fighting or competing to grab territories in Africa in the late 1990s, that's when these places were created. The British led the way in stopping other Europeans from having access to the region. That's why Ethiopia was also expanding at the time. So it was contained by the British. And that's why we have the Kenyan border on the south. You have the Somalia on the east. That's contained by the Italians and the British. And then the French in Djibouti. and Eritrea was Italian. They grabbed it. And then you have the British grabbing the entire Sudan, the Nile Valley. They grabbed the whole of it. And then grabbed what is Uganda and created it in theory because they were protecting their interest in the Suez Canal. And then because they were in Uganda, they needed to get there, so they grabbed what is Kenya and created Kenya together with the Germans. So they drew some lines and said the Germans, you keep on the south side, you keep in the north side. So essentially the countries are a result of colonialistic competition among the European powers. And so they start that way. And at the time of independence, the leaders of the African countries decided to keep those borders. They did not want to change them, although they did not have a say in the creation of those borders. They thought it wise to keep them because the alternative would be constant warfare, which would be very detrimental to the region. So the decision to keep the borders was not just the Horn area, but it was a continental decision. The creation of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, and then the discussions on what to do, and looking at the best interest of the African continent at the time. They decided, especially in the Cairo meeting in 1964, that for the sake of stability, peace, and to avoid constant warfare, the territories will not expand. And they also will not contract. So a principle of incontractability and inexpandability was adopted, and it was cemented with the doctrine of non-interference in the internal affairs of a sister republic. So that's the making of the OAU and the principles that guided it until when it was changed to the African Union. So that remains the structure. Within that, then each of the countries are the different peoples, races, ethnicities, religions, cultural behavior, and then there has been an attempt all the time to find whether there are commonalities that can unite the people together. Sometimes those commonalities are hard to come by, and you have that sort of issue to worry about. Issue of identities within each of the countries also becomes a problem as they compete to see who within the country has the upper hand on whatever. So ethnicity now becomes a player in the internal affairs of the countries, and then it tends to transnationalize from one country to another, because in each border point there are people who are split. They are the same people. So when they have problems in one country, they tend to move into the other country. And so the problems of one country become the problems of the other in that way of transnationalizing conflicts. And so how to deal with it?
Professor Macharia, you are making a very good point. The Horn of Africa is strategically the most important region for the rest of the world. So can you briefly explain what makes the Horn of Africa such important, such a strategic place for the rest of the world?
Well, apart from being the shipping line, the resources that the other parts of the world need, particularly the oil, the Arabian area, the Middle East, has a lot of oil, which the rest of the world, particularly the Europeans, need. Now to ship that oil from where it is produced, the Red Sea became very important. And this was after the French and the Egyptians constructed the Suez Canal, which meant that the competition the Suez Canal increased the strategic importance of the Red Sea, because it was not there before. But with the construction of the canal, the geopolitical value and geostrategic value of the Red Sea increased. So, and sometimes we saw one of the vessels being stuck in the Red Sea because the canal was kind of narrow, or the ship was too big, or it went the wrong way. So the value of this Red Sea was raised by the construction of the Suez Canal, which means that the country or the region there is then very important to the external forces that wanted to ship or pass their goods through the Suez Canal. That way then others, like the British and the French and the Germans, they have to go through the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and then to Asia, the other big market. And whatever they are getting or sending from Asia then has to go again through the Suez Canal. Now, that remained that way for a long time. Although there are now some thoughts that maybe the construction of the LAPSET, if it ever materializes properly, this is the big infrastructure from Lamu to Cameroon, which will then might help to move things from Western Africa to Eastern Africa, and also some things, if they are coming from the Americas and other places, can even go through there. So the value of the region is because of what it offers to the rest of the world in terms of market transfer, the goods being transported, and so it becomes that way strategic, and by association then the countries in the region acquire that, because the assumption is that if one is lost in one particular place, then the rest are likely to go.
So apparently the Horn of Africa attracts the attention of superpowers, big powers of the world. So which superpowers are here in the Horn of Africa, and for what purpose are they here in the region?
Well, for some time the big powers of the day were the United Kingdom, the French, and they really control the area. But with independence and the right of the various countries to decide for themselves who they deal with and not deal with, there were changes in the dynamics. Now, thereafter you have the involvement of the United States, the involvement of the Soviet Union, now called Russia. You have the rise of China, now a major player in the region. And these are actually the three superpowers, one can say, although one more super than the other in some ways, depending on which one. But the big three are all involved in the Horn of Africa for their own interests. Those interests are commercial, economics, they are resource-based, and they are also political. And so in trying to advance those interests, they become involved not only in terms of the corporate entities, but also military operations. We have seen that happen, and including Turkey. Turkey is struggling to reclaim its, what they used to call the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomanism they are trying to push, and President Erdogan is very eager to recreate Ottoman greatness. And in so trying to create the Ottoman greatness, the Horn of Africa becomes very important to his dream of greatness. And Somalia, so you see the Turks in Somalia are many. They have one of the biggest embassies in the world in Mogadishu. They have a big military base in Mogadishu, supposed to train the Somalis. And but Somalia is interesting because it has a lot of other countries there to train them, and there seems something happens to be going on. So the Turks are also there. The Indians would like to have a big say, but they seem to be overshadowed by China and the Russians and the Americans in this, and the French. And Djibouti has become some sort of an international colony because almost every other big power has a base in Djibouti. So when you ask why are they there, because of the location that Djibouti has in the linking the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, which, as we said, is a major highway for commerce and other activities.
So in the past, the Horn of Africa was dominated by the big powers of the day, like France, UK, and others. And after independence, after African countries got their independence, the big powers like USA, Russia, China, Turkey, and others are here in the Horn of Africa. What about UAE, United Arab Emirates, Professor?
The United Arab Emirates is a major player because it has a lot of money, which it spends in some countries, and sometimes it appears to be in competition with Qatar. the Arab countries there, they are competing with each other for influence, and they use their money to express themselves, and they get a hearing because they have money. So not only the United Arab Emirates, but Qatar, Saudi Arabia, actually those are the major players. And then they link up with Turkey and Egypt. Sometimes Egypt doesn't seem to know where it is, the other side of the, but it is also a major player in the whole thing. And they all have been using their resources or what they think they have to extend their influence in the region through one country or another. Right now, we know that they are trying to be very heavily involved in the mess in Sudan. And because the fighting in Sudan does not make any sense, but they are fighting. But if you check properly, you'll see that there might be some external hands in that particular quarrel as to why two people who used to be associated with the Janjaweed are now fighting each other and destroying the whole country. But there are also external hands in that particular challenge.
Professor Macharia, the next question could be a little bit puzzling for you. So here is the question. Is being important, is being significant to superpowers of the world a curse or a blessing? Because some experts and political analysts come to say, like, if some region is important, significant to big powers of the world, and those superpowers gonna compete for that region, and eventually those big powers will fight for that region, and the region, the Horn of Africa, is gonna be the battleground for superpowers, and ultimately peoples of the region will pay the ultimate sacrifice. Anyway, what is your view in this regard? What is your analysis on this point?
Well, there's big powers, or the superpowers, have shown interest in the Horn from the time of the Suez Canal construction. It is increasing right now because we don't have a unipolar world or hegemony anymore. There is a time when the US was in control, or appeared to be in control. It is no longer in control. It has a lot of say, yes. It's very influential and very powerful, but it is not the only player. And we have seen recently the use of what is called the drone diplomacy. These powers looking for places where there are challenges and the regimes are having problems, so they go and donate drones as a way of dealing with the insurgents, and they succeed in some instances. So the question as to whether the big powers are going to compete heavily in the region is not in doubt. They are doing it already. Whether that would mean escalating into a big war, global war, I doubt that, because they are all careful. With the nuclear capacity only a crazy person will try to see whether they can try, whether it works or not. We also have other countries which are trying to find their way. Japan is trying to be seen to matter, because when you compare Japan to China, Japan keeps on getting lost. They don't know what to do. So we saw the Prime Minister of Japan, Shikida, visit a short while ago, visiting a few African countries to see, oh, Japan also exists. But you know, Japan dominates economically the region, because every car you see in the Horn is usually a Toyota. That's Japanese conquest. And they would like to increase that to be seen better than simply selling Datsun and Toyotas, to be seen as if they also play a role in the political agenda, geopolitical agenda. They are looking for that visibility, and to stop appearing as if they are proxies or clones of the United States. See, from 1945, when they were bombed, atom bombed, the Japanese have been subservient.
Which damaged Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Come out of that. Okay.
Yeah, the atomic bomb damaged Hiroshima and Nagasaki, city of Japan, just to remind you.
Yes. So the other countries that are trying to come up and be seen, also to be players in the Horn of Africa, Japan happens to be one of them. Turkey, of course, is, you see, the problem with Turkey, it turned to Africa because it was rejected by the Europeans. Tried to get into the European Union. They didn't want Turkey as a counter move, and came that's why in the 1990s and the early 21st century, we saw a lot of Turkish activities in the continent, in the Horn. Ethiopia has all those Turkish establishments, schools, industries. They try to compete with the Chinese on infrastructure, big supermarkets and stores like Waikiki, and the military hardware. They sell a lot of drones. The Americans have a habit of ignoring Africans until they notice somebody else is interested. So they have been trying to say, okay, wait a minute. And they are not happy that the Chinese have made inroads in Africa, in the Horn of Africa. They are the ones who are supposed to be constructing the Lapsset, and even the major construction buildings in Nairobi, in Addis Ababa, and in other places are constructed by the Chinese. And people ask why. So because of that Chinese penetration, and the Chinese have penetrated every part of the world anyway, including America, there is that resentment. So they have to react and say that they are countering what's seen to be bad Chinese influence. And then you have the Russians. And the Russians have come in a big way because they want the minerals. They are getting a lot of gold from Sudan. They are getting a lot of strategic minerals in different parts of the African continent. So they are here to advance their own interest. And in so doing, they have political leverage that the Western powers do not seem to have. In part because, in fact, one can say that China and Russia have that political leverage because in the days of anti-colonialism, they are the ones who stood with the Africans against apartheid, against colonialism, while the Americans and the British and the French and the Italians were busy trying to retain or keep the colonial establishment in place. So there is that soft spot that many Africans have for both China and Russia because of the help they gave when it was needed. We have also the Italians. They have a new prime minister, a beautiful looking young lady, and she also wants Italy to be seen. And what's wrong with being vocal on matters that count?
So what is the impact of the big powers competition for countries of the Horn of Africa?
negative impact in the sense that the African leadership appears to have problems deciding for itself what is in its interest. Mm-hmm. What's going on in Sudan right now, you can see power play in the place. Mm-hmm. Okay? Somalia is a total mess. And you see a lot of big powers there. Uh-huh. And some others trying to keep others out. Uh-huh. Especially if they can keep Kenyans out of Somalia, they'll be happy. Eh? Mm-hmm. So we know some of those things are happening. Eh? And they do their best to ensure there is continued disharmony and discord, that the African countries would have some quarrels, differences. They may be minor, but they'll be expounded to appear as if they are major. So there is this contradiction, the desire to be together, to address common challenges, with the reality of the differences among the countries that are sometimes engineered to ensure that there is a quarrel and make togetherness very difficult. So there is that, the attempt, the serious desire to be together and to address common interests, and then the reality of the differences being exacerbated. Those differences then make it very difficult for the Horn of African countries to have a common agenda on almost everything. We have seen that when it comes to a UN position or global position, and then you find that there is a desire to have a common place, and then one country or another will bolt out and say, no, you are supposed to have this. In that connection, you have another African country, Morocco, which has been very active in sowing seeds of discord in some countries, mainly because of its political desire. It annexed Western Sahara. It's an aggressor there, an occupying force. And for a while it was out of the OAU because of Western Sahara, only to realize that it was not making headway, so it begged to be returned back in 2016 so that it can operate from within as opposed to operating from without. And that is also now becoming a challenge to see how they fit in and how they can advance their interests irrespective of what other countries think. And of course then you have the differences with Algeria just next door as to who. So what I'm saying is that there are a lot of forces. Some may be continental, others are extra-continental, and they are all at play in the Horn of Africa, which then makes difficult for some Horn countries to take a stand on some issues because of the pressures they are in.
Professor, do you think the superpowers, big powers of today, are destabilizing factors in the Horn of Africa?
Yes, they are. They are destabilizing, and each of them claims that it is advancing stability. Sometimes they claim things which make no sense. Some things called good governance, which means telling people what to do, and the others have something else. We don't want to interfere with the other thing. So they are all selling their own agenda. And in selling their own agenda, which are in conflict with each other, then that game is played in the Horn. So they are a destabilizing factor.
So who dominated? Good. Who dominated the Horn of Africa today?
Well, the Americans, the Chinese, not so much the Russians, although they would like to have the Turks are becoming a force. So I would say the Chinese, the Americans, and the Turks, and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, particularly in the Red Sea area. But of the big powers, it's China and the United States. And then second tier, Turkey comes in, and the Arabs.
Good. Professor, in the best of your analysis, which superpower could be a better ally for countries of the Horn of Africa?
There's something wrong with that thinking, that a particular superpower would be good for Africa and the other one would be bad. So they are both good and bad. It is up to the African countries themselves, not so much to say that they have to ally with China or with Russia or with the United States and its allies. Each of the African countries will need to reflect deeply what the its best interests are, and then deal with those other superpowers on the basis of its own best interests. It is wrong for any country to be waiting to be told where to stand or what position to take by any other power, especially extracontinental powers. We know they are not good, but that doesn't mean that they are all bad. There are some things which are good, others are not good. So instead of saying which superpower would be good for Africa, none of them is good.
You made
important.
Yeah, you made a very good point.
The independence of the African countries to decide what is in its best interest.
We have said that the big powers have already the power, the ability, the capability to construct or distract the region, the Horn of Africa. So it's up to us to manage. So how countries of the Horn of Africa should cooperate, should work with superpowers of the day?
One of the things to do is to reduce the amount of dependency on the external support. IGAD, for instance, has a lot of problems because it does not fund its own activities. It waits for the European Union and some other external forces to fund what it needs to do. And that's a major, so we need to reduce that. Even the AU, which is based in Addis Ababa, depends on these external support for its activities. So need first of all to reduce that. And once you reduce that, then to know what the dynamics at play are. Because once you know the dynamics, then you can decide how to go about it. I wrote an article some time ago saying one of the weaknesses we have as Africans is that we do not have think tanks that are indigenous. Think tanks that can anticipate challenges, threats, and even recommend the best way of dealing with arising problems. But those think tanks have to be able to do the work. Comparatively, the Chinese, the Americans, the British, and even the Russians, they have a lot of think tanks. And you wonder why? Because they have to protect the interests of their countries by thinking ahead. And one cannot think ahead by ignoring thinking. And when you ignore thinking, somebody else will pretend to think for you. And when they think for you, they are thinking for their own interest and they'll fix you. In a way, sometimes smilingly, but they'll fix you anyway. So the decision to think ahead will also require the knowledge of what these other forces are up to. We know they are promoting their interest, which is okay. So the Africans should also be promoting their interests. And the best way to do that is to have their own, to empower their thinking people to do the thinking for them, to help think. Should also realize, as I say, that there should be no naivety, because those external forces spend a lot of time thinking on how to fix the Africans. And the minute they think that you are thinking, then they'll find a way of stopping you from thinking. Especially when you start talking about protecting African interests. They'll find a way of stopping you. Sometimes people have died. and sometimes the ability is eliminated, yeah? And partly because we are overly dependent as a region. So it can be done, but we need better policy makers than we have at the top, whether they are called governments or whatever, that would have better attitude toward the interest of the region. It will help, but we have to become more self-reliant than we are in order to deal with those other forces, whether they are Indian, Chinese, Arab, European, or Americans. We need a lot of self-reflection.
Good.
But it can be done.
Good, Professor. I think the unity and solidarity between and among countries of the Horn of Africa is super important. So how can countries of the Horn of Africa should cooperate to withstand the multifaceted influence of the big powers?
Well, that's what I'm saying. They need to go into self-reflection. For one, they need to create stability within their own countries, because when there is no stability in the country, that's an avenue for external forces to come in and make life difficult. And right now we have a lot of countries which are having difficult lives because the governments are not able to maintain stability, and they are busy thinking of how to suppress their opponents, and they are busy not worrying about the country as such, but about their own survivals as presidents, ministers, or prime ministers, or whatever it is. Now, with stability, they might be able to rethink and to be able to support, facilitate, fund proper thought, long-term thought. It can be done once they feel secure in their own backyard. Then they can talk to each other on how to promote the common agenda in the form. One more, I think I can maybe add something that we call a grand strategy, and that requires some resources. And in grand strategy approaches, the humanities are very important, about the human behavior, political behaviors, the various strategies of the governance, of the conquest of military, the protections. Unfortunately, and this is very unfortunate for the Horn of Africa and much of Africa, leaders and policymakers have been misled to claim that the humanities are not important, that studying history and philosophy is not good. So you have policymakers who are not thinking beyond their technicalities, and these are easier to manipulate because maybe they are the ones who then get a few millions here and there, and then they sell the whole country. So we need, that's what I'm saying, we need a proper rethink. We need our people to know their history. Right now they don't, because there has been a deliberate effort to make people ignorant and lose their identity. And one way of losing identity is to lose your history. And since there has been that deliberate effort for people to lose their identity by losing their history, then your ability to think in terms of the interests of the place of which the identity is one of them disappears. And there are forces out there who are willing to ensure that you keep on losing that, so that they can force some agenda on you. Some of them not very nice. But then you are told you have to have, you know some of these things. So there is, if you are going to talk about having think tanks and reorganize the rethinking Africa for the sake of Africa, we have to go back to the basics. And the basics involve knowing oneself. They involve the history, the good and the bad.
Professor Macharia Munen, Professor of History and International Relations at the United States International University. Professor Macharia Munen is also Associate Fellow at the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Professor Macharia Munen, I hope I will see you in another show. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Dear viewers, that brings us to the end of our program for today. Many thanks for watching, and see you then.